Imagine, if you will, stepping back into the world of medieval Europe roughly between the 11th and 14th centuries. The air is often damp, the streets muddy, and the castle walls cold. But in the minds of the nobility, there was another battlefield entirely, the battlefield of love. You, as a young noble, might find yourself staring at a piece of parchment, quill in hand, attempting to craft the perfect love letter. But unlike today, where you might send a text or slide into someone's DMs, your words had to survive the perilous journey of illiteracy, slow postal systems, and the scrutiny of a vigilant chaperone. Courtly love was a paradox, intensely emotional, yet governed by rigid rules that made genuine connection nearly impossible. The origins of courtly love can be traced to the troubadours of southern France in the 11th century. These travelling poets and musicians were often employed by noble courts to entertain, but they also created songs and poetry extolling love most frequently. Love that was impossible, unrequited, or dangerously secret. It was not about companionship or household management, as modern dating emphasizes. It was about devotion, often to a married noblewoman, and a desire to demonstrate loyalty, refinement, and eloquence. To understand the difficulty of medieval romance, consider this. Expressing your feelings was less about personal connection and more about adhering to a societal script. Every phrase, every metaphor, was weighed for its propriety and elegance. A poorly phrased compliment could ruin your reputation faster than being caught stealing bread from the castle pantry. Suppose you are a young knight in northern France, enamored with a lady from a neighboring castle. You have heard of her from gossiping servants or fleeting glimpses at a local feast. She might be married, as many women of status were married for political alliances or property consolidation rather than love. Nonetheless, your task is clear. You must demonstrate devotion through letters, songs, or small tokens. These letters were rarely brief. They were often elaborate, filled with allegories and references to courtly ideals. Imagine spending hours attempting to convey admiration without appearing vulgar, all while ensuring that your verses didn't accidentally insult the lady's husband or your own social standing. The delivery of such a message was itself a trial. Unlike today, there was no secure or confidential messaging system. Letters often passed through several hands. A servant, a squire, or even a trusted messenger from a distant castle. Each intermediary introduced the risk of interception, misinterpretation, or, in the worst case, public humiliation. If a letter fell into the wrong hands, a simple romantic gesture could transform into a scandalous accusation of impropriety. The stakes were high, and the anxiety palpable. The letters, painstakingly written, could vanish forever or worse, arrive with unintended consequences. But why did people engage in this elaborate game of epistolary romance? One reason was social expectation. Nobility was measured not just by land or military prowess, but also by refinement, manners, and the ability to participate in courtly rituals of love. A young knight who could compose an elegant verse, demonstrating his affection, humility, and respect for social hierarchies, earned status among his peers. Meanwhile, the lady's reputation could also be enhanced by how well she inspired such devotion. Love, then, was performative as much as it was personal, a stage upon which societal roles were both reinforced and displayed. Despite the risks, or perhaps because of them, courtly love fostered a strange sort of intimacy. Consider the token exchange. A ribbon, a glove, or a small jewel might be discreetly sent with a messenger. Each object was symbolic, imbued with meaning, and interpreted through the strict conventions of courtly behavior. A ribbon from a lady's hair was not merely a gift. It was a declaration, carefully calibrated, that acknowledged her power while confirming your devotion. But here is where the daily grind of medieval life intruded. These gestures often had to be timed around the lady's schedule. the availability of messengers, and the whims of overlords. Every small act of affection was entangled in bureaucracy, social hierarchy, and the slow pace of medieval life. Moreover, the actual experience of reading and writing these letters could be excruciating. Literacy rates were low. Even among the nobility, a poorly educated squire or knight might struggle to form proper sentences, and this could diminish the intended effect of the message. The content of the letters was formulaic, filled with repeated metaphors comparing the lady to stars, roses, or the sun. One can imagine how tedious it became. Yet, adherence to these clichés was necessary to demonstrate refinement. A letter devoid of metaphor or elegance risked ridicule, which, in the courtly world, could be socially fatal. Outside the immediate circles of nobility, love letters occasionally became public spectacles. A misdelivered letter could circulate through servants, sparking gossip, jealousy, and political complications. In extreme cases, accusations of infidelity could lead to duels, exile, or even execution. Though rarely, this constant threat meant that young lovers had to cultivate patience, ingenuity, and discretion. Unlike the immediacy of modern dating, medieval courtship was slow, convoluted, and fraught with external pressures. Interestingly, courtly love was not always about sexual desire. Often, it was about honor, devotion, and self-discipline. A knight might adore a lady from afar for years, without any hope of physical intimacy. The love was aspirational, designed to elevate the character of the lover. It was as much about shaping personal virtue as it was about gaining the affection of another. Letters, poems, and gifts served as evidence of this effort, a testament to how seriously society regarded these performative displays of devotion. And yet, despite all this formality, there were moments of genuine connection. The letters, despite being formulaic, sometimes captured real emotion. Historians occasionally uncover correspondences that reveal humor, despair, or longing that transcends societal expectations. Imagine discovering a letter where a knight complains not about winning the lady's favor, but about missing her smile at a recent feast, or a lady lamenting how boring life is without the small attentions of a devoted admirer. These glimpses show that even within the rigid framework of courtly love, human emotion persisted, often in surprisingly relatable ways. But the question remains: in a world where every word was scrutinized, every gesture calculated, and every action potentially misinterpreted, how did anyone ever find true companionship? Did any of these carefully crafted letters actually lead to lasting relationships? Or were they mostly exercises in social performance, doomed to vanish into the corridors of history, unread or misunderstood? The world of medieval romance was painstaking, slow, and often deeply frustrating, a reality that makes you wonder, if dating was this complicated centuries ago, how did anyone survive the emotional labor of love? And what lessons, if any, do these awkward letters hold for the way we approach love today? If you found the first section slightly exhausting, brace yourself. Medieval courtship wasn't just about letters and metaphors. It was also about the tedious logistics of maintaining a relationship in a world without phones, cars, or even reliable roads. Imagine a society where communication could take days, weeks, or even months, and every interaction was mediated by social hierarchy, geography, or duty. If your heart had been captured by a lady in a neighboring castle, your devotion was constantly tested, not only by her approval, but by the practical challenges of moving through a rigidly structured society. The life of a knight or nobleman was busy, filled with military campaigns, estate management, hunting, and attending courtly events. A single letter, even if perfectly written, might be delayed because a messenger had to cross muddy paths, evade bandits, or gain permission to enter a rival castle. The process of delivering a message was so complicated that entire chapters of medieval literature focus on these journeys, often emphasizing the suspense and anxiety caused by delays. One can imagine pacing the Great Hall, worrying whether the lady had received the ribbon you sent last week, or whether your carefully phrased poem had arrived intact. It was a world in which patience was not just a virtue, it was mandatory. Moreover, the social rules surrounding courtly love were labyrinthine. Even if your feelings were genuine, your actions were constantly constrained by the expectations of others. For instance, the lady you admired might be under the watchful eye of her mother, her brothers, or a chaperone whose primary duty was to ensure propriety. Your attempts to communicate could be hindered by anyone in her household, either through skepticism or outright interference. A gift might be intercepted, a compliment misinterpreted, or a poem read aloud before it was meant to be private. The anxiety created by these social barriers made medieval romance a slow, almost bureaucratic process. Every step forward was weighed against 1,000 potential pitfalls. Consider also the seasonal and environmental difficulties. Roads were often impassable during rainy months. Rivers lacked reliable bridges. Winter could render travel impossible. Knights and messengers carried letters across long distances, facing not just the threat of weather, but also robbery and violence. The physical danger of delivering a love letter might sound dramatic, but in practical terms, it was an everyday concern. You had to account for these variables when plotting even the most basic gesture of affection. A miscalculation could result in a letter lost forever, a token damaged or stolen, or your intentions being misread entirely. Even when communication succeeded, the content of these letters could be maddeningly complex. Courtiers often had to write with extreme subtlety, using metaphors that required both sender and recipient to share a particular cultural literacy. A metaphor that seemed simple, such as comparing a lady to a rose, carried layers of meaning, invoking purity, beauty, and virtue simultaneously. A poorly chosen image could unintentionally imply ridicule or impropriety. Writing a successful letter required not only literacy, but also knowledge of literature, local gossip, and the moods of influential figures. It was a meticulous process that could consume hours, leaving the sender anxious over whether a single word could cause offense. Meanwhile, ladies in these scenarios were often under extraordinary pressure. The act of receiving letters was as socially complicated as writing them. Accepting or rejecting tokens of affection was never merely personal. It was a statement that could affect family alliances, reputations, and even political relations. A misstep could create scandal. An overlooked poem could be interpreted as snubbery, and a visible blush at the wrong moment might be discussed for weeks. Women had to navigate this intricate dance with both intelligence and caution. In many ways, their emotional labor exceeded that of their male counterparts. They were expected to inspire devotion, interpret messages correctly, and preserve their honor simultaneously. Yet amidst this complexity, there were innovations. Secret codes, clever puns, and symbolic tokens were common. Lovers developed ways to communicate indirectly. A particular flower meant one sentiment, a folded ribbon meant another. These symbols were understood only by those in the know, creating a private language within a public, heavily monitored world. The ingenuity required to maintain even minimal secrecy is almost exhausting to imagine. A single misplaced gesture could unravel months of careful planning. Yet these small victories, an intercepted message correctly interpreted, a token successfully delivered, brought immense satisfaction. Let's not forget the role of poetry and music. Troubadours and minstrels often performed at feasts, spreading tales of romantic devotion across courts. A single verse could be quoted and requoted, adding prestige or ridicule to its subject. This performative aspect of love ensured that private affection quickly became a social spectacle. You couldn't simply write a poem in solitude. It was read aloud, judged, and sometimes responded to publicly. The careful balance between privacy and social performance made the act of courtship even more stressful. Every attempt to express emotion was, simultaneously, a performance, a gamble, and a social maneuver. An interesting twist comes when we examine the role of humor in these letters. While most courtly love emphasized elegance, metaphors, and idealized devotion, there were occasional moments of levity. Some letters included playful teasing, jokes about rival suitors, or humorous exaggerations of one's own suffering from unrequited love. These passages reveal that medieval romance was not entirely grim. People still had the human need to joke, to vent, and to exaggerate their emotions. Humor served a dual purpose. It humanized the sender and demonstrated their creativity, a key marker of status in a society that prized wit as much as courage. However, despite these clever strategies, many attempts at medieval romance ended in frustration. Messages went unread, tokens were returned, and some admirers spent years in unrequited longing. Marriage, the ultimate social expectation, was often arranged for reasons entirely separate from affection. Love, in the medieval sense, was frequently a slow, indirect, and profoundly frustrating exercise in patience. People developed resilience and cunning, yes, but they also endured humiliation, misunderstanding, and disappointment on a scale that would be unimaginable to anyone accustomed to texting or social media. And yet, some romances did flourish. Historical records, letters, preserved in archives, anecdotes recorded by chroniclers, reveal that certain correspondences blossomed into long-term relationships. But these successes were rare, contingent on timing, social circumstances, and a degree of luck that could scarcely be planned. Most lovers navigated a labyrinth of obstacles, often learning more about patience, discretion, and social rules than about the object of their affection. Courtly love, in essence, trained people to endure, to plan meticulously, and to measure every gesture, often at the expense of spontaneity. By the end of this intricate, exhausting system of correspondence and devotion, a curious question emerges. Did medieval people actually experience love as we understand it today? Or was it more of a structured exercise in social performance? Were the letters, poems, and tokens genuine expressions of the heart, or elaborate tests of patience, loyalty, and literary skill? The answer is unclear. Perhaps, in a world where life was short, brutal, and regulated, the slow, complicated, and often frustrating rituals of courtly love were the only way to inject human connection into a rigidly hierarchical society. And yet, as you imagine the painstaking efforts, the lost letters, the intercepted tokens, and the painstakingly calculated verses, one can't help but wonder, how did people manage to keep their hearts intact while participating in such a maddeningly bureaucratic form of affection? By the time you reach the third section of a medieval love story, you've likely grown weary of waiting, just as the lovers themselves must have felt. Months, sometimes years, could pass between a letter written in hopeful devotion and a response, if there was one at all. The conclusion of these courtly romances was rarely dramatic and often mundane. Yet it was here, at the intersection of patience, strategy, and social expectation, that the true consequences of medieval love were revealed. What happens when months of carefully crafted words finally meet reality? First, let's examine the outcomes for the lovers themselves. For some, courtly love remained entirely unfulfilled. Letters never returned, tokens disappeared, or the lady married a wealthier or more politically advantageous suitor. In these cases, knights and would-be lovers were left with the emotional residue of months of effort and anticipation. Medieval society offered few outlets for lamentation. Public displays of grief were tightly controlled, and excessive melancholy could even be seen as weakness. Instead, suitors often found consolation in continued service, poetry, or rechanneling their energies into martial endeavors. A frustrated knight might compose a final letter, perhaps a poem, to express unrequited longing, which could then be stored, preserved, or forgotten, depending on the whims of fate. Yet, not all attempts ended in disappointment. Occasionally, courtly love led to actual relationships, although these were usually unconventional by today's standards. Since social and familial pressures dictated much of romantic life, a union born from mutual affection often required delicate negotiation. One recorded example involves a French noblewoman and a persistent admirer whose letters survived in abbey archives. After months of correspondence, token exchanges, and the careful mediation of friends and relatives, the two were married not necessarily out of passionate love, but because the ritualized devotion demonstrated the suitor's suitability in a socially acceptable way. In essence, success in courtly love often depended less on emotion than on demonstrating patience, intelligence, and adherence to protocol. Love, in this sense, was an exercise in competence rather than spontaneity. Interestingly, these outcomes reveal an essential paradox of medieval romance. While it seemed rigid and formulaic, it also cultivated resilience and social skill. A knight who navigated months of intercepted letters, traveling messengers, and skeptical guardians developed strategic thinking, persistence, and diplomacy. Likewise, a noblewoman skilled at reading subtle messages and responding without scandal honed emotional intelligence, patience, and discretion. In other words, the arduous process of courtly love shaped people's characters, often more effectively than any battlefield or scholarly pursuit. Love became less a matter of passion and more a disciplined art, a form of social training embedded within personal desire. The role of humor and playfulness should not be overlooked. Some correspondences reveal that lovers, despite the formal conventions, delighted in clever wordplay, subtle jokes, and minor tests of wit. For example, a lady might send a token with an intentionally ambiguous meaning, observing how the knight interpreted it. Similarly, a knight might exaggerate his own suffering in verse, poking fun at the overly serious conventions of courtly love. These small bursts of creativity offered relief from the otherwise monotonous and carefully monitored rituals. They show that even in the most regulated societies, human spontaneity finds a way to emerge, often through subtle defiance of the rules. Beyond the personal outcomes, these awkward letters and slow-burning romances also had social and cultural implications. The widespread practice of courtly love influenced literature, music, and art for centuries. Stories of unrequited devotion, secret messages, and symbolic gifts filled the pages of chronicles and poetry. The concept of romantic idealism, as opposed to purely transactional marriage, began to take root, shaping European cultural expectations long after the Middle Ages ended. Even if most letters never led to real romance, they contributed to a broader understanding of love as an aspirational, complex, and performative experience. In a sense, these tedious correspondences laid the groundwork for the modern notion of romantic pursuit, slow, often awkward, but deeply meaningful. Yet one cannot escape the question: at what emotional cost did these lessons come? Lovers endured frustration, confusion, and the constant risk of scandal. A single misdelivered letter could ruin reputations, and the psychological toll of delayed or unrequited love was profound. Medieval romance demanded extreme patience and a willingness to subordinate immediate desires to the slow grind of protocol and hierarchy. The human experience of these relationships was, in many ways, far more exhausting than any modern dating app could ever be. As reflect on the end of these correspondences, the final image is often quiet and understated. A letter, finally delivered, tucked carefully into a lady's personal chest. A token, long awaited, pinned to a gown with trembling fingers, or perhaps a sigh of relief as a messenger returns from a perilous journey. The climax of medieval courtship was rarely a dramatic declaration or a stolen kiss. It was the mere successful completion of the steps required by social and logistical constraints. And in that quiet moment, one can glimpse the enduring human desire for connection, however mediated, delayed, or constrained by circumstance. In conclusion, the world of courtly love teaches us that human ingenuity, patience, and social skill can flourish even in the most mundane or frustrating circumstances. Love letters, awkward metaphors, intercepted tokens, and endless waiting were all part of a system designed to shape character as much as facilitate romantic connection. Whether the correspondence ended in lasting companionship, social recognition, or quiet disappointment, the rituals of medieval romance left an indelible mark on European culture and, in subtle ways, on the way we still think about love today. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: love, in any era, is rarely straightforward. Even centuries ago, people navigated bureaucracy, social pressures, and sheer inconvenience in the pursuit of connection. And so, as you drift into sleep, imagine a knight pacing a muddy courtyard, quill in hand, hoping his carefully chosen words will reach the heart of a lady who may never respond. In a world without instant messaging, romance was not measured in moments, but in patience. And that, in itself, is a story worth remembering. If the first story introduced you to the awkward, painstakingly slow world of medieval courtly love, this next story will shift focus to a more practical, though equally exhausting, aspect of romance in the Middle Ages: marriage as a transaction. While courtly love relied on letters, tokens, and metaphorical devotion, the real engine driving most medieval unions was economics, property, and social strategy. For most people, particularly those of wealth or status, love was secondary to the practical arrangements of family alliances and financial security. To understand dating in this era, you must first understand the concept of the dowry, the intricate deals surrounding it, and the painstaking negotiations that made medieval marriages function like carefully balanced business contracts. A dowry, in its most basic form, was the property, wealth, or goods a bride brought to her husband upon marriage. This could include land, money, livestock, household goods, or jewelry. The size and composition of the dowry were a reflection of the family's wealth, status, and influence. For families of the nobility, dowries were rarely symbolic. They were critical in cementing alliances between households, enhancing social standing, and ensuring the economic survival of both parties. Unlike in modern weddings, where money may be spent on flowers, dresses, and catering, medieval marriages were often evaluated purely in terms of their financial and strategic benefits. A poorly arranged dowry could result in economic disaster or social humiliation. The process of negotiating a dowry was, by today's standards, excruciatingly slow and formal. Families often engaged in months of discussion over precise details: the value of land, the number of servants or livestock included, and the timing of transfers. Legal documents were drawn up by notaries, sealed with wax, and sometimes witnessed by clergy to ensure legitimacy. Every item was itemized and assigned value, often leading to disputes over minor points: a cow here, a piece of jewelry there, or the precise acreage of a parcel of farmland. These negotiations required patience, diligence, and a keen understanding of local laws and customs. Young couples had little say in the matter. Their feelings were secondary to the larger social and financial equation. For women, the dowry was both a tool and a constraint. A substantial dowry could elevate a woman's desirability, ensuring she married someone of higher status or wealth. Conversely, a meager dowry could result in an undesirable match or force a woman into a convent. Families sometimes saved or borrowed extensively to create an impressive dowry, understanding that it was an investment not only in their daughter's future, but also in the family's political and economic standing. This meant that, in practical terms, Women were often judged less on personal qualities than on the financial contribution they could bring to a marriage. Every coin, every piece of jewelry, and every parcel of land was a calculated step in a social transaction. The men's families, on the other hand, had their own motivations. Accepting a dowry meant access to additional wealth, resources, and sometimes political leverage. Refusing or renegotiating a dowry could offend a neighboring family, or even spark feuds. Men, therefore, had to carefully navigate the balance between securing a valuable match and avoiding social conflict. It was a delicate dance, often mediated by parents, counsellors, and even local clergy, whose approval was essential to legitimize the arrangement. The entire process could take months or even years, as families calculated the risks and benefits of every detail. It is important to note that dowries were not uniform across Europe. In southern regions like Italy or France, dowries were often substantial and meticulously itemized, while in parts of northern Europe, smaller gifts or symbolic property transfers were more common. Local custom dictated what was considered acceptable, which further complicated negotiations. For example, in some areas, a dowry had to be returned to a woman's family if her husband died without heirs, while in others, it became part of the husband's estate permanently. Understanding these regional differences was crucial for families attempting to protect their wealth and social standing. A misstep could lead to long-term financial or legal complications. The marriage market was also intertwined with legal and religious systems. The church played a major role in regulating unions, overseeing dowries, and ensuring that marriages adhered to canonical law. Clergy often mediated disputes over dowries and could enforce contracts or annul marriages in extreme cases. Since marriage was considered a sacrament, religious authorities had significant influence over how deals were structured. They could dictate timing, require witnesses, and ensure that contracts were fair, or at least appeared fair. This added another layer of bureaucracy, slowing the process and making negotiations even more laborious. Interestingly, these transactions often required creative strategies to resolve conflicts or balance competing interests. Families might arrange surrogate guarantees, such as assigning land to a third party until a dowry could be fully paid, or including clauses that allowed for incremental delivery of gifts. Such arrangements were often documented in meticulous legal language, producing volumes of paper records, contracts, receipts, and witness statements that survive today as a testament to the painstaking effort required for what we might now consider a simple marital arrangement. Despite the heavy emphasis on material gain, personal affection was not always absent from these arrangements. Some couples found genuine companionship or affection within the constraints of their financial and social obligations. Letters and personal notes occasionally survive in archives, revealing small moments of tenderness amidst the bureaucratic rigor of dowries and negotiations. These glimpses suggest that while marriage was heavily transactional, human emotion persisted, and some couples developed affection through shared experience, mutual respect, or simply the familiarity bred by living together. But such moments were rare, often secondary to the economic and social realities of the time. The marriage market also had broader social consequences. By concentrating wealth, land, and power, it reinforced social hierarchies and perpetuated inequality. Noble families who mastered the art of negotiation secured not only advantageous matches, but also long-term influence over regional politics. Conversely, those who mismanaged dowries risked poverty, scandal, or social decline. For commoners, similar systems existed, but were scaled to local economies. Bride price payments, small dowries of livestock or grain, and sometimes labor obligations served similar social and economic functions. Across all classes, marriage was never simply about love. It was a strategic and deliberate act, with consequences extending far beyond the couple themselves. One of the most fascinating and perhaps tedious elements of the dowry system was its sheer attention to minutiae. Consider a contract in which a single cow is worth precisely a specific sum, or a pair of gloves is enumerated in legal language to ensure clarity. These details, while mundane, were crucial. Disputes often arose over the smallest items, requiring years of negotiation or legal intervention. The level of precision demanded in arranging these marriages is almost exhausting to imagine from a modern perspective. Every coin, every item of clothing, every field of land was subject to scrutiny, negotiation, and legal documentation. And yet, despite the overwhelming focus on material considerations, there remained a quiet recognition of human vulnerability. Dowries were intended to provide security for women, to ensure that they could survive and maintain status, even if their husbands died or failed to protect them. In this sense, the laborious negotiations were not purely selfish or transactional. They also reflected a practical understanding of social survival. The medieval marriage market, with all its complexity, inefficiency, and tedium, was a system designed to balance the competing demands of economy, law, and human need. A system in which romance, though present, was often a faint, secondary consideration. So, as you imagine this world, long meetings between family elders, scribes laboring over contracts, the constant calculation of every item, and the anxious anticipation of young couples waiting for decisions, you are faced with an unresolved question. In a society where love was often subordinated to economics and strategy, how did individuals find personal happiness, satisfaction, or connection? Were there moments of genuine warmth, or did most couples simply learn to endure the arrangement they were given? By the time negotiations were underway for a medieval marriage, the young couple often found themselves caught between the abstract mechanisms of wealth and the reality of daily life. Unlike modern dating, which can be fleeting or impulsive, medieval betrothal required a prolonged period of adjustment, preparation, and expectation. Once dowries were agreed upon and contracts signed, the so-called marriage market did not end. In fact, it was only entering its most demanding phase: implementation. A key aspect of this phase involved preparation for cohabitation. Young women from noble families often left the homes in which they were raised to live with their future husbands and in-laws. This transition required substantial logistical and emotional adjustments. Not only did the bride need to adapt to a new household, but she also had to ensure that her dowry was properly delivered, accounted for, and incorporated into the estate. Household inventories were meticulously recorded, sometimes with lists of dozens of individual items: tapestries, cooking utensils, livestock, clothing, and silverware. Servants were often assigned the task of overseeing the transport and management of these possessions, ensuring nothing was lost or misappropriated along the way. For the bride, each lost or damaged item was more than an inconvenience. It could be perceived as a slight against her family's honor. For the groom, the arrival of the dowry represented both opportunity and responsibility. The influx of wealth, land, livestock, or money was often critical to maintaining the estate, paying debts, and funding local influence. Mismanagement could lead to financial strain or family disputes. The practical reality of integrating a dowry often meant weeks or months of administrative work, including hiring accountants or estate managers, redistributing property, and negotiating with tenants. The process was laborious and slow, and in some cases, it created tension within households. Disputes over how dowry items were used were common, and even minor disagreements could escalate into legal battles or prolonged family conflicts. But the dowry system did more than just distribute wealth. It shaped social expectations and gender roles. Women were expected to oversee domestic management and to provide heirs, while men were expected to provide protection, governance, and economic stewardship. Even in marriages where affection developed naturally, these social roles remained firmly defined. The transactional nature of the arrangement often overshadowed personal choice, creating an environment where emotional fulfillment was secondary to duty. Young couples were thrust into these roles with little preparation, and their survival emotionally, socially, and economically depended on their ability to navigate them successfully. One particularly tedious but crucial aspect of the dowry system was the legal oversight required in case of disputes. Medieval Europe lacked standardized courts, so enforcement of dowry agreements often depended on local lords, ecclesiastical courts, or arbitration by influential figures. If a husband refused to honor the agreed terms, or if a widow sought restitution, the resolution could take years. Letters and legal petitions were written, messengers dispatched, and intermediaries consulted, all to resolve disagreements over property or money. This bureaucratic machinery ensured that dowries were rarely informal, but it also added layers of stress and delay for the individuals involved. It is difficult to overstate how much time, effort, and worry went into making sure every detail of the dowry was properly executed. Dowries also had significant long-term implications for family strategy. Noble families often arranged multiple marriages across generations to consolidate power, extend influence, or secure strategic alliances. A single well-managed dowry could elevate a family's status for decades, while a poorly negotiated or lost dowry could destabilize social standing. As such, families devoted considerable energy to matchmaking, negotiations, and record-keeping. Young individuals rarely participated in these decisions fully, yet their futures, and sometimes their lives, were determined by them. The tediousness of these arrangements extended beyond one marriage, influencing generations and shaping regional politics in ways that were rarely visible to the casual observer. Even amid this bureaucratic rigor, there were moments of personal adaptation. Couples had to learn to live together, manage estates, and fulfill social roles. In some cases, this led to mutual respect, companionship, or even affection. Letters, if permitted, could provide a private space for self-expression. Occasionally, a woman who entered a marriage with reluctance discovered shared interests or understanding with her husband. Similarly, men sometimes found appreciation for a wife's administrative skill, intelligence, or practical guidance. These small, quiet victories highlight that, even within a highly structured system, human resilience and adaptability could shape personal experience. The dowry system also impacted economic behavior and planning on a broader scale. Large dowries often required families to sell or mortgage land, arrange loans, or redirect resources. Estates were managed not only for current survival, but for future negotiations. Planning for dowries was a long-term exercise, sometimes spanning decades. Families invested heavily in tangible assets and social influence to maximize their daughters' marital prospects. In essence, the marriage market served as both a mechanism for wealth distribution and a tool for social engineering, dictating patterns of influence, land ownership, and power consolidation across regions. Interestingly, the system had inherent inequalities built into it. Wealthier families could command more advantageous matches, while poorer families faced limited options or were forced into less desirable unions. This created a stratified society in which marriage reinforced social hierarchies rather than disrupted them. Dowries became instruments of control, subtly dictating who could marry whom and under what circumstances. Even love, if it emerged, had to contend with these structural constraints. Romantic inclinations were filtered through the lens of wealth, strategy, and social obligation, often requiring individuals to compromise desires for the sake of survival or advantage. The practical outcomes of this system were simultaneously impressive and exhausting. On one hand, dowries provided security, consolidated wealth, and stabilized social relations. On the other, they demanded extraordinary patience, meticulous planning, and acceptance of limited personal choice. For the young couple, each step from negotiation to cohabitation was both a test of endurance and a lesson in survival within a rigidly hierarchical world. The mundane details of property transfer, inventory management, and legal compliance dominated their lives, leaving emotional connection as a subtle, sometimes hidden, aspect of their experience. As we consider these realities, one cannot help but wonder, in a society dominated by financial negotiations and strategic marriages, how did people find ways to create intimacy, trust, or affection? Was love relegated entirely to private moments, or did it emerge slowly and unexpectedly amid the tedium of estate management, inventory lists, and legal disputes? By the time a medieval marriage reached its final stage, the months, or sometimes years of negotiation, paperwork, and logistical preparation were complete. The contracts were signed, witnesses sworn, dowries delivered, and estates reorganized. For the young couple, life had officially moved from the theoretical to the lived reality. Unlike modern weddings, where the ceremony might be the climax, medieval unions were less about spectacle and more about the slow, deliberate consolidation of wealth, power, and social obligation. And yet, amidst the tedium of property transfers and household management, the human element quietly persisted, sometimes in unexpected ways. For many couples, the first months of marriage were consumed by mundane tasks. The bride might oversee the management of her dowry, checking inventories of livestock, linens, silverware, and land. She was expected to ensure that the property she brought to the marriage was protected, properly accounted for, and contributing to the estate's ongoing productivity. The groom, meanwhile, had to integrate these resources into the wider workings of his household, paying debts, and ensuring that the combined assets of the two families were effectively deployed. The romance of marriage was often secondary to the practicalities of running a medieval household, and the emotional labor required to navigate these tasks was immense. Yet within this structured environment, personal dynamics began to emerge. Even in marriages arranged purely for strategic advantage, the necessity of daily interaction created space for companionship. Couples learned to negotiate shared routines, communicate about household matters, and navigate the social expectations placed upon them. In some cases, small gestures, cooperative decision-making, shared meals, or private conversations fostered trust and quiet affection. While passion may not have been the starting point, patience and shared responsibility sometimes laid the foundation for genuine connection. This slow, understated development of intimacy was a hallmark of medieval marital life, and it highlights a human resilience that transcends the rigid frameworks of social and economic expectation. The delivery and management of the dowry itself often provided opportunities for subtle power dynamics to play out. A well-organized bride could assert authority over the household, demonstrating competence and reinforcing her value beyond the material contributions of the dowry. A husband's ability to manage his bride's assets effectively reflected on his skill and intelligence. In this way, what might seem like tedious bookkeeping or inventory management was also a form of social negotiation, shaping perceptions of status, capability, and respect within the marriage and the broader community. Conflicts were, of course, inevitable. Misunderstandings over property, disagreements about household priorities, or disputes about inherited obligations could strain relationships. Widows were particularly vulnerable if the husband died prematurely. The question of whether dowries would revert to her family or remain in the estate often became a point of contention. Legal recourse was available, but slow and cumbersome. Ecclesiastical courts or local lords sometimes intervened, issuing rulings that required careful compliance. The emotional weight of these disputes added another layer of complexity to the already intricate system of tellably arranged marriages. Despite these challenges, some marriages did produce what we might recognize as emotional fulfillment. Couples sometimes discovered shared interests, intellectual compatibility, or mutual respect that developed into affection over time. Historical accounts provide glimpses of spouses expressing care, humor, or admiration in letters or household records. These instances, while rare, compared to the vast number of purely transactional arrangements, demonstrate that even in the most structured, strategically motivated marriages, human connection could flourish. Affection was often slow-burning and modest, manifesting in cooperative management of estates, protection of family interests, or quiet attentiveness to each other's needs. Dowries also had lasting societal impacts. They were central to the concentration and redistribution of wealth across generations, shaping political alliances and reinforcing social hierarchies. Strategic marriages, with carefully negotiated dowries, enabled families to expand influence, acquire land, and consolidate power. In some cases, these arrangements allowed families to recover from financial crises, stabilize succession, or create networks of support that extended far beyond the immediate household. The material rigor of dowries thus served a dual function, securing personal security for women and reinforcing broader structures of power and hierarchy. Yet the human stories within these structures were often overlooked. A young woman moving into a new household, navigating unfamiliar servants and routines, managing her dowry while learning to assert her authority. These daily struggles were the real-life dramas behind the formal contracts. Likewise, a husband balancing the integration of new assets, household management, and social obligations experienced his own share of stress and adaptation. These experiences, though unromantic and tedious by modern standards, reveal resilience, ingenuity, and the subtle ways humans found ways to assert agency and maintain dignity within rigid systems. In some remarkable cases, dowries served not only as instruments of negotiation, but also as sources of empowerment. Women who brought significant resources into a marriage could exert influence over household decisions, protect younger children, or support charitable works in their communities. Their ability to navigate the dowry system effectively allowed them a degree of autonomy rarely afforded to medieval women. Similarly, men who respected and managed dowries conscientiously could enhance their reputation, gain loyalty from servants, and ensure long-term stability for their lineage. In this way, even the most mundane details of economic negotiation had profound personal and societal consequences. By the conclusion of this process, one can see that the marriage market was not merely an impersonal mechanism. It was a lived reality that shaped personal experience, family strategy, and societal structure. The tedious negotiations, careful inventories, and legal contracts were more than bureaucratic exercises. They were the scaffolding upon which human lives, ambitions, and social relationships were built. Love, in the traditional sense, may have been secondary, but human adaptation, patience, and ingenuity were central. Individuals found ways to navigate constraints, assert agency, and create connection within a system designed to prioritize economics over emotion. And yet, the lingering question remains: in a world dominated by financial and strategic considerations, what did happiness look like? Did couples find satisfaction in shared responsibilities, in quiet companionship, or in the successful management of their households? Or did they simply endure the arrangements as a necessary part of life, finding fleeting moments of comfort in a system that often left personal desires unmet? The answer is likely a mixture of both, leaving us to wonder whether the painstaking mechanics of medieval marriage were ultimately a means of survival, social advancement, or on rare occasions unexpected fulfillment. As you imagine these carefully arranged unions, consider this: every contract, every cow, every inventory list carried the weight of expectation, family honor, and social strategy. Yet within that weight, human beings found ways to live, adapt, and sometimes even thrive. The boring mechanics of dowries and deals, tedious as they were, reveal much about resilience, patience, and the subtle art of negotiating life in a world far less forgiving than our own. If medieval marriage negotiations were an exhausting exercise in economics, then the daily reality of dating, or even just interacting with the opposite sex, was a lesson in restraint, surveillance, and meticulous social control. In the medieval world, young people were rarely allowed privacy, and almost every interaction between potential partners was monitored by adults, servants, or formal chaperones. This constant supervision was intended to protect honor, ensure propriety, and prevent scandal. But from the perspective of the young people involved, it could make the already complex game of romance feel like an endless labyrinth of rules, observation, and frustration. Chaperones were an essential part of medieval life, particularly for women of any social standing. Their duties ranged from simple supervision to the full enforcement of moral conduct. In wealthy households, the chaperone might be a trusted older female relative, a governess, or a servant, specifically tasked with overseeing interactions between young men and women. In some cases, multiple chaperones were employed simultaneously, one monitoring outdoor activity, another overseeing letters, and a third attending social gatherings. Young men, too, were observed in certain circumstances, particularly in courtly settings where their behavior could reflect on their families. The sheer logistics of this surveillance system meant that every conversation, every gesture, and every meeting was laden with scrutiny. The origins of chaperone culture were rooted in both morality and social necessity. In a world where marriages were heavily transactional, the reputation of a young person could affect not only their own prospects, but the fortunes of their entire family. A woman who was perceived as immodest or flirtatious could be denied advantageous matches, while a man who behaved improperly risked fines, duels, or social disgrace. Consequently, constant supervision became a social imperative, a way to maintain the delicate balance between personal desire and family or societal expectations. Privacy was not just discouraged, it was actively curtailed, and sometimes even treated as a risk to social stability. Imagine a young lady preparing for a local feast, perhaps hoping to catch the eye of a promising suitor. She would not simply appear unaccompanied. She would likely be escorted by a female relative or servant, carefully instructed in proper conduct and reminded of the subtle rules governing posture, conversation, and eye contact. The young man she hoped to impress would similarly be aware of surveillance, both formal and informal. Servants might report back to parents or elders about who was speaking to whom, what gestures were exchanged, and whether anyone overstepped their bounds. This constant monitoring created a highly constrained environment in which even small expressions of affection or interest required strategic planning. A glance, a compliment, or a whispered word could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or recorded in memory for later discussion. Letters, of course, were also subject to supervision. Private correspondence, which we might consider intimate or romantic today, could be read by chaperones, parents, or trusted servants. A seemingly harmless expression of admiration might be interpreted as scandalous, while a carefully coded message could be missed entirely. The risk of exposure meant that young lovers had to learn subtlety, inventiveness, and discretion skills that, in a modern context, would feel almost like espionage. Every word had to be weighed, not only for its social propriety, but also for the likelihood of interception or misinterpretation. Social gatherings, too, were carefully staged to maximize observation. Feasts, dances, and communal events allowed interaction, but rarely unsupervised interaction. In larger households or courts, multiple generations of family members, advisors, and servants would attend. providing multiple layers of oversight. Even when a young couple managed to find a moment alone, perhaps during a brief walk in a garden or along a castle corridor, they were often mindful of potential observers. The anxiety generated by this omnipresent supervision shaped behavior, making interactions formal, strategic, and constrained by a constant awareness of consequence. Interestingly, the chaperone system was not universally oppressive. It also served a protective function. In a world without modern policing or legal protections for women, the presence of a responsible adult could prevent harassment, assault, or coercion. For parents, particularly those with valuable dowries or socially prominent daughters, ensuring that potential suitors did not exploit young people was a matter of survival. Chaperones were, in this sense, both enforcers and guardians, balancing social expectation with practical protection. However, for the young people themselves, chaperones often felt like obstacles to any authentic emotional experience. Courting required patience, strategy, and creativity. Lovers had to find ways to communicate through gestures, glances, or subtle signals that could pass unnoticed or be misinterpreted as entirely innocent by their watchers. A slight touch of a hand, a shared smile, or even a prolonged gaze required both courage and a deep understanding of social rules. In some cases, clever lovers devised intricate systems of signals, coded phrases, or symbolic gifts that could convey meaning without attracting attention. The constant negotiation between desire and surveillance created a uniquely tense and, by modern standards, exhausting form of romance. The stakes were high because reputation was paramount. One minor slip could tarnish a young woman's prospects or a young man's honor. Families monitored the behavior of children and their peers meticulously, and gossip traveled quickly through social networks. Even a misinterpreted gesture at a feast could lead to weeks of discussion and speculation. In this context, chaperones acted as both shields and judges, ensuring that propriety was maintained and reporting breaches back to the family hierarchy. Despite the constraints, moments of ingenuity emerged. Lovers adapted to surveillance in subtle ways, passing notes hidden in books or garments, sending messages through intermediaries, or using public events as opportunities for indirect communication. These tactics required patience, timing, and careful observation of patterns in household routines. The presence of chaperones, while frustrating, forced young people to develop emotional intelligence, creativity, and discipline. In other words, the oppressive structures of surveillance simultaneously honed skills necessary for survival, negotiation, and eventual social integration. Yet the question lingers. In such a heavily monitored and restrictive environment, could genuine intimacy or affection survive? Were medieval young people able to cultivate personal connections under the ever-watchful eyes of chaperones? Or was their emotional experience largely shaped and limited by the constant oversight? The tension between desire and supervision is a thread that runs through countless accounts, letters, and anecdotes from the medieval period, suggesting that even small successes, communication, trust, or companionship were hard-won achievements. And so, as you picture this world of feasts, corridors, and gardens patrolled by ever-present chaperones, consider the challenge faced by young lovers to navigate their emotions, communicate subtly, and maintain composure, all under the unyielding gaze of adults determined to control the narrative of their lives. It was a world in which romance existed, but only in the margins, shaded by obligation, strategy, and the ceaseless attention of others. The real question, lingering at the end of this first section, is this: when every gesture and word is observed, regulated, and potentially reported, how did people experience love and desire at all? Could the heart truly be free? Or was it always bound by the relentless framework of social expectation? If the first section gave you a sense of the oppressive structure surrounding medieval romance, Section 2 takes us deeper into the daily realities of living under constant surveillance. In this world, young men and women could rarely act on desire freely, and even the simplest interactions required careful calculation. Social life itself became a series of rehearsed steps, where every gesture, glance, or phrase might be scrutinized by someone with authority. The chaperone, in this sense, was both an ever-present obstacle and a silent instructor, shaping behavior, morality, and strategy. Daily routines were carefully orchestrated. For young women, mornings often began with supervision over personal activities. Dressing, grooming, and attending to personal hygiene were not private acts. Older women, servants, or female relatives ensured that propriety was maintained at all times. The selection of clothing, jewelry, and even the manner in which a lady walked or spoke was subject to evaluation. Every detail could signal virtue, wealth, or social acumen. A misstep, a dress too revealing, a hairstyle deemed inappropriate, or even a mismanaged smile could be remarked upon and reported to the matriarch of the household. In this way, young women were constantly educated in the subtleties of social surveillance, learning how to navigate observation without losing personal dignity. Young men faced their own monitored routines. In households or courts, they were expected to demonstrate decorum, martial skill, and moral propriety. Supervisors, tutors, or elder relatives often observed their interactions, instructing them in how to comport themselves in public and private spaces alike. Even when engaging in conversation with peers or family members, young men had to exercise caution. Certain jokes or opinions could be interpreted as signs of arrogance, impropriety, or social ignorance. Social training, therefore, was inseparable from surveillance. Learning to act correctly was not just an educational exercise, but a survival strategy in a world where reputation was paramount. Social gatherings, feasts, dances, religious ceremonies were arenas of particularly intense scrutiny. While these events offered opportunities for flirtation or courtship, they were never free from oversight. Chaperones, relatives, and household staff monitored proximity, eye contact, and verbal exchange, often taking mental or written notes to report breaches or successes. Even the act of dancing could become a negotiation of boundaries. A bow, a hand extended, or a subtle touch required careful timing and observation. Any perceived breach could result in gossip or censure. To navigate these gatherings successfully, young people had to combine social awareness, timing, and subtlety, transforming mundane movement into a delicate game of observation and restraint. Letters and written communication were also under scrutiny. Young lovers learned to encode messages through symbolism, allegory, or the careful selection of gifts. A flower might convey a private sentiment. A folded ribbon might symbolize affection, and even handwriting style could carry meaning. But because letters were often read or intercepted by chaperones, servants, or family members, decoding and crafting these messages required ingenuity. A message had to be legible enough to convey emotion, yet obscure enough to protect both sender and recipient from scandal. This created an environment in which literacy, creativity, and social cunning were essential tools for anyone attempting romantic communication. Interestingly, the system of supervision encouraged some innovation in human behavior. Young people became skilled in reading subtle cues, interpreting facial expressions, and understanding the rules of propriety without explicit instruction. They learned to negotiate moments of privacy within public spaces, glances exchanged during a procession, coded phrases whispered while passing by a window, or discreet gestures during communal chores. These tiny victories, though modest, were psychologically significant. They allowed individuals to feel a sense of agency and emotional connection, even in a world dominated by rules and observation. However, the emotional toll of constant surveillance cannot be overstated. Young people experience frustration, anxiety, and the difficulty of unspoken desire. The need to carefully monitor every action created tension and delayed the natural flow of intimacy. Love, when it existed, had to operate within the margins of control. The omnipresence of chaperones meant that even private thoughts could feel constrained, creating an environment in which the heart learned patience by necessity. It was an emotional rigor that few modern individuals could imagine, a slow-burning tension that persisted for months or years, with small rewards tempered by the persistent awareness of observation. Moreover, the influence of chaperones extended beyond the immediate household. Gossip networks, local clergy, and visiting dignitaries all played a role in reinforcing social norms. A minor misstep walking too closely, with a suitor, laughing too loudly, or being alone in a secluded space could be interpreted as impropriety. The threat of social consequence ensured compliance, but it also created anxiety and shaped personal behavior in profound ways. In essence, the medieval dating world operated like a carefully controlled theatre, with young people performing within a stage bounded by observation, morality, and hierarchy. Despite these constraints, the chaperone system did allow for human ingenuity. Secret couriers, coded letters, and subtle signals allowed communication to bypass formal supervision. Lovers sometimes found ways to convey genuine sentiment without being discovered. Small acts of kindness, helping with household chores, sharing knowledge, or attending to a companion discreetly, became substitutes for romantic expression. These adaptations highlight the resilience and resourcefulness of young people operating under social pressure. Even in a heavily monitored environment, they found ways to maintain emotional connection and cultivate intimacy, however modest or hidden. Yet the system was not infallible. Misunderstandings and false reports could damage reputations or disrupt budding relationships. A chaperone might misinterpret a gesture, a servant might exaggerate, or gossip might travel faster than reality. These errors could lead to social tension, family intervention, or even the termination of a potential match. The stakes were high. Navigating observation required not only awareness of social rules, but also the ability to anticipate misinterpretation and manage appearances meticulously. By the end of this section, one realizes that constant supervision created a paradox. While intended to protect, guide, and enforce morality, it also complicated genuine human interaction. Every action had layers of significance. Every moment of privacy had to be negotiated, and every word or gesture was potentially weighted with consequence. Lovers became strategists, actors, and communicators all at once. They learned subtlety, patience, and emotional calculation skills that were honed not through freedom, but through constraint. And so the question remains, unresolved for now, when every moment of potential intimacy is observed, policed, or recorded. How did young people experience desire, trust, or connection? Did love thrive in the margins? Or was it forever constrained by the ceaseless gaze of authority, duty, and social expectation? By the time a young couple reached the point of potential marriage in the medieval world, they had already navigated years of surveillance, social scrutiny, and strategic constraints. The role of the chaperone, while often frustrating, had been constant, a silent observer, moral enforcer, and social regulator. Section 3 explores how young people ultimately lived, loved, and adapted within this strict framework, revealing that even in a society of omnipresent supervision, human connection found ways to emerge. In households and courts, the presence of chaperones gradually shifted as trust and competence were established. A young woman who demonstrated propriety, diligence, and discretion could be granted slightly more freedom, such as supervised walks in the garden or limited interaction with peers under acceptable circumstances. Similarly, young men who proved their respectability, patience, and social awareness earned a measure of latitude, allowing them to demonstrate character, wit, or even subtle affection. These carefully managed allowances created rare pockets of opportunity in which genuine human interaction could flourish. For many couples, Small, almost invisible gestures became the language of connection. A shared smile across a room, a discreetly exchanged note, or a subtle acknowledgement during a group activity carried immense significance. These seemingly minor acts were, in fact, carefully negotiated victories against the structures of observation that dominated their lives. Each successful interaction reinforced trust, created anticipation, and allowed emotional bonds to develop, even if only in private moments or fleeting glimpses. The stakes were high, but the rewards human connection in a world built on constraint were profound. Letters remained central to communication, though their content and delivery required ingenuity. Lovers often developed complex codes. Flowers, folded ribbons, or seemingly mundane household objects could carry personal meaning. Even the timing of delivery was important. Letters sent at predictable intervals, read aloud in front of a chaperone, or hidden in books or clothing, had to convey the intended sentiment without violating social norms. These small acts of cleverness demonstrate the creativity required to maintain intimacy within a heavily policed environment. Young people had to balance caution with expression, and emotional intelligence became a critical survival skill. The influence of chaperones extended to public interactions as well. Feasts, religious ceremonies, and communal labor provided opportunities for subtle exchanges, but always under observation. Courting gestures had to be indirect and symbolic. A hand held for a fraction of a moment, a gaze exchanged across a crowded hall, or a carefully orchestrated conversation could signify interest without attracting censure. The constant negotiation between visibility and privacy, action and restraint, created a complex social choreography. Each movement, each word, carried layers of meaning, blending propriety with desire. Despite the tension, many young couples discovered resilience and adaptability. The constraints imposed by chaperones forced them to become keen observers of behavior, adept interpreters of subtle cues, and inventive communicators. Skills learned under supervision, discretion, patience, strategic thinking, shaped relationships in ways that were profound, though often invisible to historians. Even in a system designed to limit emotional freedom, human ingenuity found paths for expression and connection. Yet the challenges were undeniable. Miscommunication, misinterpretation, and social gossip could derail budding relationships. A single inappropriate gesture, real or imagined, might result in prolonged scrutiny, reprimand, or even the termination of courtship. Families, servants, and neighbors wielded influence that could override personal desire. Emotional labor was constant, managing appearances, anticipating observation, and maintaining propriety required continuous attention and effort. This environment made every small success in intimacy both rare and valuable. Interestingly, some chaperones themselves became facilitators rather than obstacles. Experienced, wise, or empathetic guardians sometimes allowed private exchanges, created cover for communication, or subtly advised on acceptable gestures. In such cases, supervision was not merely control, but guidance, enabling young people to navigate the complexities of social expectation while cultivating meaningful relationships. The dual role of chaperones, as both enforcers and enablers, highlights the nuanced social structures of medieval life, where authority and opportunity were intertwined. The ultimate outcomes of relationships, shaped under chaperone supervision, were varied. Some couples transitioned smoothly into marriage, having developed mutual understanding, patience, and trust through careful, monitored interactions. Others faced ongoing tension, miscommunication, or frustration, reflecting the constant pressure of observation and the limitations imposed by social norms. Yet, even in less ideal circumstances, the experience of navigating a world of surveillance left individuals with skills in negotiation, discretion, and emotional management tools that proved invaluable not only in relationships, but in broader social and political life. By the end of this system, it becomes clear that chaperones, while restrictive, were part of a complex social ecosystem. They mediated desire, preserved family honor, and shaped behavior. But they also inadvertently nurtured creativity, strategic thinking, and subtle forms of human connection. Young people learned to act with foresight, interpret nuance, and communicate in ways that required ingenuity and emotional intelligence. What appears as oppressive from a modern perspective was, in practice, a rigorous training ground for social, emotional, and relational skill. And so, as you reflect on the medieval world of constant supervision, consider this final thought. Even under relentless observation, human desire and connection endured. Every small smile, every subtle gesture, every hidden message was a triumph of ingenuity and persistence. The medieval heart, constrained as it was by social expectation and chaperone vigilance, still sought and found ways to navigate intimacy. Perhaps this is a lesson across centuries, that even in the most regulated environments, human beings will find a way to connect, love, and adapt, one quiet, measured step at a time. In a world before text messages, email, or instant notifications, communication was an entirely different ordeal. If you were living in medieval Europe, even sending a simple message could require days, weeks, or months of painstaking effort. The slow pace of messaging shaped almost every aspect of daily life, from trade negotiations to military strategy, and, of course, romance. The delays, uncertainties, and inevitable miscommunications made dating a uniquely frustrating experience, especially for anyone hoping to court a potential partner through letters, messengers, or symbolic tokens. Imagine a nobleman stationed hundreds of miles away from the lady he admired. To convey a message, he could not simply type a note and hit send. Instead, he would have to rely on a network of couriers, each responsible for traveling dangerous roads, often on horseback, through harsh weather, bandit territories, and unmarked paths. Letters were typically written on parchment. Ink had to be prepared, quills cut to precision, and words carefully considered. Mistakes could render a message illegible or convey unintended meaning. Once the letter was complete, it was entrusted to a messenger who might carry multiple letters, goods, or orders, further complicating logistics. Distance alone introduced delays. A journey that would now take hours could take weeks in medieval times, depending on terrain, weather, and available transportation. Roads were often poorly maintained, bridges were few, and river crossings could be treacherous. In winter, heavy snow could halt travel entirely, while spring rains turned paths into muddy quagmires. Couriers were human and fallible. Illness, exhaustion, or accidents could delay or prevent delivery entirely. Every message became an exercise in hope and uncertainty, requiring patience that would seem unimaginable to someone accustomed to instant communication. Even if the letter reached its destination, another layer of delay awaited. The recipient. A young lady might be under constant supervision by chaperones, limiting her ability to receive or read letters privately. Families could open correspondence to ensure propriety, and messages might be held for days or weeks before being delivered to the intended person. The contents could be censored, misinterpreted, or altered, either intentionally or inadvertently, adding further complications to communication. The sender could never be sure that the letter would be read as intended, and the recipient had to navigate both social norms and the practicalities of household management before responding. These constraints affected not only personal communication, but also commerce, governance, and diplomacy. Merchants relied on messengers to relay prices, orders, and inventory, while rulers depended on couriers to transmit orders, news of troop movements, and political intelligence. Delays could have serious consequences. missed market opportunities, misunderstandings between allies, or delayed military action could alter the course of events significantly. For individuals attempting to pursue romance, the stakes were perhaps smaller, but equally psychologically taxing. Months of effort, careful composition, and risk-laden delivery could result in a single misunderstood phrase or a letter that never arrived. The content of letters had to be crafted with particular care, without the ability to clarify immediately. Writers needed to anticipate potential misreadings. Subtle gestures, word choice, and phrasing were crucial. In romantic correspondence, the challenge was especially acute. A metaphor intended to convey affection could be misinterpreted as arrogance or flattery, and a miswritten verse could be a source of embarrassment or social censure. Lovers had to balance creativity with clarity, poetry with prudence. The delay between sending and receiving added emotional weight. Anticipation could transform hope into anxiety and longing into frustration. Messengers themselves were key figures in this system. Trusted couriers were often highly valued, trained to navigate routes safely, avoid bandits, and deliver messages accurately. Some were employed by noble households or merchant networks, while others worked independently or under royal contracts. The relationship between sender and messenger was critical. A careless or untrustworthy courier could jeopardize sensitive information or ruin delicate negotiations. In the context of romance, a misplaced or intercepted letter could create scandal, misunderstanding, or heartbreak. The human factor, reliability, honesty, and skill was as crucial as the words written on parchment. Young people under chaperone supervision had to navigate an additional layer of control. Letters might be read aloud in the presence of a guardian, passed between servants, or delayed until an appropriate time. Couriers and intermediaries often acted as informal censors, judging what was acceptable and what might provoke disapproval. The constant mediation of communication transformed even simple messages into complex social exercises, requiring foresight, subtlety, and patience. One striking aspect of medieval messaging is the sheer variety of methods employed to overcome these challenges. Letters were carried by horseback, foot messengers, ships, or pigeons in some cases. Signals such as smoke, bells, or flags were used for short-distance communication, particularly in military contexts. Couriers often traveled in convoys for protection, and messages were sometimes disguised to prevent interception. Each method had advantages and limitations, and the choice of delivery was itself a strategic decision. The slow pace of communication meant that even minor delays could compound into months of uncertainty, shaping relationships, business, and governance alike. For lovers, this system imposed an emotional rhythm unfamiliar to us today. The cadence of a relationship depended not on daily conversation or spontaneous interaction, but on weeks-long pauses, punctuated by the arrival or failure of a carefully worded letter. Patience was not a virtue but a necessity, and miscommunication was the rule rather than the exception. Every letter became a gamble. It might arrive intact, be delayed, or never reach its destination, leaving the sender to worry, speculate, or imagine the worst. The slowness of messaging also created opportunities for creativity. Couriers could deliver small gifts along with letters, flowers, tokens, or symbolic objects that reinforced the intended message. Writers developed elaborate allegories, coded phrases, and poetic devices to convey layered meaning without risk of misinterpretation. Lovers learned to express emotion in ways that accounted for both delay and potential censorship, transforming the tedium of waiting into a form of social and emotional strategy. Yet the overarching reality was one of uncertainty and frustration. Unlike our modern instant communication, medieval correspondence required careful calculation, strategic thinking, and remarkable patience. The emotional toll, especially in romantic contexts, was immense. Lovers spent months imagining responses, interpreting the absence of letters, and adjusting behavior based on incomplete information. The pace of communication shaped thought, action, and expectation, making even the simplest interactions a carefully measured and mentally taxing endeavor. As you imagine this world of painstakingly written letters, treacherous journeys, and delayed responses, consider the unresolved question that looms over every medieval messenger. In a society where communication could take months and misunderstandings were inevitable, how did people manage desire, maintain trust, and sustain relationships? Was romance simply postponed indefinitely, or did human ingenuity find ways to bridge the gaps imposed by distance, danger, and delay? By the time a letter had been entrusted to a messenger, the journey itself became an adventure or a potential disaster. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of roads, rivers, and trails, many of them poorly maintained, treacherous, or subject to sudden hazards. Travelers faced natural obstacles such as rivers swollen by spring rains, mountain passes blocked by snow, or dense forests harboring wild animals. Human threats, bandits, thieves, and political instability were equally pressing. Couriers were often armed and trained, but even they could not guarantee delivery. For lovers, this meant that each message carried not only emotion, but a considerable element of risk. A misplaced letter could disrupt a courtship entirely, creating weeks or months of uncertainty. The time factor was particularly burdensome. Journeys that would seem simple today, 100 miles, perhaps could take days or weeks, depending on terrain and mode of transport. A horseback messenger could cover more ground than a foot traveler, but horses required rest, food, and water, and rough roads often limited speed. Coastal or riverine transport offered an alternative. But these routes were subject to storms, piracy, and delays at ports. Every day added to the tension between sender and recipient, stretching anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Waiting became an inescapable part of medieval life, a test of patience that could affect emotion, judgment, and decision-making. When the message finally reached its destination, another layer of complexity emerged: interpretation. Letters, particularly those containing romantic or sensitive content, were rarely read in isolation. Chaperones, family members, or household staff often mediated access, reading aloud or inspecting correspondence before it reached the intended person. This added both a censoring and protective element. Words could be altered, misread, or deliberately withheld. For the sender, there was no certainty that the letter would be read as intended. For the recipient, there was no privacy to guarantee authenticity. Communication became not just a matter of writing, but a strategic exercise in anticipation and risk management. In some cases, couriers themselves played active roles in this process. Trusted messengers could offer advice, interpret subtle instructions, or even negotiate small adjustments if circumstances demanded. Some couriers were familiar with the households they served, knowing which family members could be counted on for discretion and which might misinterpret intent. Yet this reliance on human intermediaries was a double-edged sword. A trusted messenger might die, become delayed, or fail to deliver the letter accurately. Each human link in the chain introduced uncertainty, creating a system in which communication was inherently precarious. For romantic correspondence, the challenges were particularly acute. Young people often relied on symbolism, allegory, or subtle gestures to convey meaning without attracting disapproval. A single misplaced word could create scandal or miscommunication, particularly when letters were scrutinized by others. Gifts, ribbons, flowers, or small tokens often accompanied letters to reinforce intent, providing a tangible anchor for meaning. Couriers had to deliver both words and objects safely, further complicating the process. Lovers developed ingenuity, creativity, and caution in equal measure, turning what might seem a simple act of communication into an elaborate dance of strategy and patience. Delays were not only inevitable, but psychologically significant. Months might pass between sending a letter and receiving a reply. During this time, the sender had little certainty about how the message was received, whether it was appreciated, or whether circumstances had changed. The emotional tension of waiting was compounded by social obligations. A young person had to maintain appearances, obey rules, and navigate daily life without revealing anxiety or impatience. Anticipation became a central feature of the emotional landscape, transforming communication into a slow, deliberate test of endurance, both practically and emotionally. This slow pace also shaped the content of letters. Writers often included elaborate explanations, repeated points for clarity, and carefully considered phrasing. Poetry, allegory, and symbolism were employed to convey subtleties that could not be immediately clarified in person. Each letter was a miniature performance, demanding attention to both literary skill and social nuance. The art of writing became inseparable from the art of survival, requiring patience, creativity, and awareness of the hazards of misinterpretation. Interestingly, the limitations of the system also fostered resilience and adaptability. Young people learned to manage uncertainty, anticipate obstacles, and navigate social networks with subtlety. Couriers became essential connectors, and social intelligence, knowing whom to trust, how to phrase requests, and when to act, was highly valued. Even the mundane frustrations of slow messaging were formative, teaching patience, strategic thinking, and emotional regulation. In a way, the delays themselves shaped the character of relationships, making emotional expression more deliberate and considered than impulsive. Yet, despite ingenuity and careful planning, failure was a common occurrence. Letters were lost, intercepted, or misunderstood. Misdelivered correspondence could spark anxiety, suspicion, or even scandal. Lovers had to contend with the possibility that months of effort could amount to nothing, leaving relationships suspended in uncertainty. This precariousness was part of the medieval experience. Nothing moved quickly, and every step of communication required diligence, strategy, and a tolerance for frustration. The slow pace of messaging also influenced social dynamics beyond romance. Merchants negotiated deals across regions, nobles coordinated estates and alliances, and rulers issued orders across domains. The delays and uncertainties inherent in communication shaped decision-making, often requiring caution, redundancy, and contingency planning. In this context, romantic correspondence was not merely inconvenient. It was an emotional microcosm of broader societal constraints, reflecting the intricate interweaving of distance, risk, and human ingenuity. By the end of this section, it is clear that medieval communication was an exercise in patience, strategy, and resilience. Lovers, like merchants and rulers, had to navigate the complexities of distance, unreliable messengers, and constant oversight. Each message carried emotional weight and material risk, requiring foresight, creativity, and flexibility. Waiting was inevitable, misunderstandings were probable, and success required skill as much as luck. The unresolved question remains: in a world where every word took weeks to reach its destination, and every message could be delayed, lost, or misinterpreted, how did young people maintain emotional connection, trust, and desire? Could romance truly flourish, or was it forever constrained by the painfully slow pace of medieval communication? By the time a letter finally arrived at its destination, the emotional landscape it entered was often already complex, shaped by weeks or even months of anticipation, speculation, and anxiety. The medieval world of messaging was not just a matter of conveying information. It was an exercise in endurance, imagination, and patience. Lovers learned to navigate uncertainty, to interpret subtle signs, and to maintain faith in the intentions of the sender, even when proof of those intentions was delayed or obscured. When a message arrived, it was often mediated by multiple layers of social control. Chaperones, family members, and household staff might read, comment on, or even censor correspondence before it reached the intended recipient. A young woman might have to wait for a trusted servant to deliver a note to her privately, and a young man might not know for weeks whether his letter had been received at all. These delays and interferences added both tension and strategy to the act of messaging. Lovers learned that timing, discretion, and subtlety were as important as the words themselves. A single misstep could compromise trust or invite social censure. Despite these obstacles, medieval lovers were remarkably inventive. Letters were often accompanied by gifts, symbolic tokens, or small gestures to reinforce meaning. A carefully chosen flower, a folded ribbon, or a gift of embroidered cloth could express affection in ways that words alone could not. Couriers were instructed to deliver items safely, often requiring careful navigation of dangerous roads, vigilant observation of the recipient's household, and attention to timing. The physical journey of a message became intertwined with its emotional significance, transforming communication into a ritual of care, risk, and patience. Some relationships thrived despite or even because of these delays. Lovers learned to savor anticipation, to develop subtle methods of expression, and to build resilience in the face of uncertainty. The act of waiting became a shared experience, fostering reflection, imagination, and emotional discipline. The slow pace of messaging required a kind of strategic courtship. Each letter or token had to be carefully considered, timed, and crafted for maximum effect. This deliberate rhythm may have allowed for deeper thought, more intentional expression, and a heightened appreciation of small victories in communication. Of course, not all messages succeeded. Letters were lost, intercepted, or misinterpreted. Couriers fell ill, roads were blocked, and storms delayed delivery. Even well-crafted letters could be misunderstood by chaperones or relatives who acted as intermediaries. The risk of miscommunication was constant, and the emotional stakes were high. A misplaced phrase or delayed response could generate weeks of worry, prompting speculation about the other person's feelings, intentions, or fidelity. These hazards required both creativity and patience, and they shaped not only personal relationships, but the psychological resilience of individuals navigating them. Interestingly, the very limitations of medieval messaging fostered a distinct set of social and emotional skills. Lovers learned to anticipate potential delays, to interpret subtle signals, and to act with discretion. They cultivated emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to manage both hope and frustration. In many ways, the slow pace of communication acted as a training ground for patience, ingenuity, and resourcefulness. The trials of messaging honed skills that were valuable not only in romance, but also in commerce, governance, and family management. Messengers themselves became integral to this system, their reliability and judgment critical to success. A skilled courier could deliver multiple letters and gifts across great distances, navigating natural hazards, bandits, and political instability. Couriers sometimes acted as trusted intermediaries, delivering messages at carefully chosen times, or conveying nuances that could not be written explicitly. Their role was not merely functional. They were enablers of connection, mediators of meaning, and sometimes silent witnesses to the emotional labor of medieval relationships. The ultimate lesson of medieval messaging is that love and communication were deeply intertwined with patience, strategy, and resilience. Every letter, every token, and every delivery attempt was a microcosm of the broader challenges of medieval life. Distance, uncertainty, and the constant need to navigate social constraints. The emotional experience of courtship was thus inseparable from the mechanics of delivery. Lovers were required not only to feel affection but also to master timing, negotiation, and interpretation. a demanding process that tested both ingenuity and endurance. By the conclusion of this system, one can see that the painfully slow pace of medieval messaging was more than an inconvenience. It was a defining feature of social, romantic, and political life. The delays, risks, and uncertainties of communication shaped behavior, relationships, and expectations, creating an emotional landscape marked by anticipation, creativity, and endurance. In a world without instant communication, patience became a crucial virtue, ingenuity, a necessary skill, and every successful exchange, a small triumph of human resilience. And yet, the lingering question remains. When messages could take months to arrive, and misunderstandings were inevitable, how did people sustain trust, hope, and affection? Did love endure simply because it had to? Or did the struggle to communicate across time and distance give it a deeper, quieter strength that modern instant messaging could never replicate? In the medieval world, courtship was rarely a quick or casual affair. Unlike the modern, often spontaneous processes of dating, courtship in the Middle Ages was a prolonged, painstakingly structured series of interactions designed to protect reputations, enforce social hierarchies, and ensure that any potential union served economic or political interests. For young people, the experience could feel interminable, a slow march through ritual, observation, and carefully controlled interaction, with every gesture scrutinized and every word weighed against social expectation. Courtship was a social performance as much as a romantic endeavor. Families, particularly of the upper classes, approached the process with the same meticulous attention as a business negotiation or alliance-building exercise. The young woman's behavior was closely monitored to ensure propriety, while the young man's demeanor, speech, and manners were equally assessed. Courtship often began with public appearances, communal events, and supervised encounters. Dinners, dances, and religious ceremonies provided opportunities for initial observation, but private interactions were rare and closely regulated. Every step of the process had symbolic meaning and was interpreted through the lens of social convention. The rituals of courtship were long, deliberate, and often repetitive. A young man might spend months attending the same gatherings, offering small gestures of respect, presenting gifts, or participating in carefully orchestrated social interactions. A young woman, meanwhile, had to navigate her role with care, balancing the desire to be noticed with the need to maintain propriety. Even a fleeting glance or smile carried weight, potentially signaling interest or defiance. These repeated rituals created a slow rhythm, where trust, observation, and mutual recognition were developed gradually over extended periods. Gift-giving was a central component of medieval courtship. Tokens, ribbons, embroidered cloth, and other symbolic objects communicated interest, affection, or intent without violating social norms. However, the timing, presentation, and context of these gifts were crucial. A gift delivered too early might appear presumptuous, while one presented too late could be misinterpreted as disinterest. The courtship ritual required not only patience, but also careful calculation, strategic timing, and an acute awareness of social hierarchy. Gifts were rarely spontaneous. They were deliberate acts meant to reinforce social bonds, demonstrate attentiveness, and signal capability as a potential spouse. Letters and messages often conveyed through trusted intermediaries or couriers, extended the ritual over distance. These communications required careful attention to tone, content, and subtlety. Writers employed allegory, poetry, and symbolism to express sentiments that could not be communicated openly, navigating the constraints imposed by chaperones, household staff, and social norms. The delay, inherent in sending and receiving messages, compounded the slow pace of courtship, making each exchange a calculated and emotionally significant event. Supervised visits, walks, and social encounters were similarly structured. A chaperone might accompany a young lady on a stroll, observing her interactions, monitoring gestures, and ensuring adherence to decorum. Young men had to learn to approach such interactions with caution, subtlety, and awareness of potential misinterpretation. Every conversation, from casual remarks to compliments, was evaluated not only for propriety, but also for insight into character, social standing, and suitability as a future spouse. The process was deliberately slow, requiring repetition and patience, with progress measured in small increments rather than immediate results. Even for individuals of lower social standing, the pace of courtship was dictated by practical realities. Opportunities for interaction were limited, with work, family obligations, and social expectations constraining the time available to pursue romantic interest. Courtship often involved repeated, regulated encounters at community events, religious observances, or local markets, with each meeting serving as a carefully negotiated stage in a longer process. The slow accumulation of knowledge, familiarity, and trust mirrored the formal structures of aristocratic courtship, albeit in a more modest context. Social observation played a critical role throughout these prolonged rituals. Friends, family members, and even neighbors acted as informal monitors, reporting on behavior, interpreting gestures, and offering advice or warnings. Young people were aware that every action could be evaluated and remembered, creating a social environment in which restraint, strategic thinking, and self-control were essential. A single misstep, a flirtatious word, an ill-timed compliment, or a breach of decorum could jeopardize months of careful progress. Interestingly, the slowness of courtship often intensified emotional engagement. The drawn-out process allowed young people to observe one another over time, detect consistency of character, and develop nuanced appreciation for subtle behaviors. Anticipation, expectation, and delayed gratification became central features of the experience. In a sense, the tediousness of ritual reinforced the value of the connection. Affection developed slowly, carefully, and deliberately, shaped by observation, patience, and shared participation in social frameworks. Yet the drawn-out nature of medieval courtship also generated anxiety, uncertainty, and frustration. Young people had to negotiate personal desire, family expectations, and societal scrutiny over extended periods, often with no guarantee of success. The protracted pace required emotional discipline, resilience, and strategic thinking. Courtship was as much about survival within a social system as it was about romantic interest. Each stage involved careful navigation of rules, rituals, and risk, making the process as taxing as it was structured. By the end of this first stage of courtship, one sees that medieval romantic practices were a delicate balance between ritualized behavior, emotional negotiation, and social observation. Progress was measured not in days or weeks, but in months and years. With every small victory, the first smile, a successfully delivered gift, a discreetly shared moment, carefully earned through patience and skill. Love, if it emerged, did so gradually, tempered by social expectations, and nurtured in small increments, under the unrelenting gaze of family, friends, and the wider community. And yet, the unresolved question remains: when every interaction is orchestrated, every gesture monitored, and every exchange deliberate, how much of the affection cultivated in these lengthy courtships was genuine desire, and how much was a carefully managed performance of social expectation? Could true intimacy survive the slow, ritualized machinery of medieval romance, or was it inevitably shaped and limited by the weight of centuries-old custom? If the first section revealed the painstaking structure of medieval courtship, Section 2 dives deeper into the human experience within these slow, ritualized processes. Courtship was not merely a social requirement or a family obligation. It was an intricate, emotional exercise, a negotiation of desire, reputation, and patience that shaped personal behavior and social understanding over months or even years. For young women, the courtship process often required careful observation of potential suitors. They learned to interpret gestures, gifts, and words, while constantly under the watchful eyes of family members or chaperones. A noblewoman, for instance, might attend multiple feasts, dances, or religious gatherings, noting how a particular young man conducted himself in public, how he treated servants, or how he engaged with his peers. Every nuance of demeanor was significant. A man who displayed respect, attentiveness, and decorum signaled reliability, while an impulsive or boastful gesture could be grounds for disapproval. Over time, these observations became a form of slow emotional learning, helping the young woman develop judgment, discernment, and strategic decision-making about potential partners. Young men, conversely, navigated a different set of challenges. They were expected to demonstrate propriety, patience, and resourcefulness, while simultaneously signaling interest and suitability as a partner. This often involved repeated, carefully orchestrated interactions, attending events in the right attire, offering socially appropriate gifts, and finding moments to communicate subtly despite chaperones and family oversight. A misplaced compliment, an over-eager approach, or a poorly timed gesture could undermine months of effort. Men had to exercise not only social skill but also foresight, anticipating how each action would be interpreted in the broader context of the courtship. Gift-giving became an art form in itself. Objects were selected for symbolic meaning. Ribbons, embroidered cloth, or handcrafted items conveyed messages of attention, admiration, or intent. Timing was crucial. A gift delivered too early might appear presumptuous, while one sent too late risked being seen as lackluster or inattentive. Sometimes, gifts were intended to demonstrate economic capability, an indirect assurance to the family that the young man could provide stability. At other times, gifts carried emotional symbolism, offering subtle cues about personal preference, affection, or shared interests. Each item, carefully chosen and delivered, became a vital component of a courtship narrative, encoding meaning for both recipient and observers. Letters amplified this complexity, especially when distance prevented direct interaction. Written correspondence required meticulous attention to language, tone, and symbolism. Poetry, allegory, and subtle phrasing allowed young people to communicate emotions indirectly, navigating the strictures imposed by chaperones and household oversight. Letters were often delayed, misread, or intercepted, adding further tension and uncertainty. Lovers had to cultivate patience and strategic thought, imagining responses and anticipating potential misunderstandings long before they could be resolved. Emotional intelligence, creativity, and foresight became essential tools in a relationship constrained by time and social convention. Social events provided another arena for courtship, but even these encounters were heavily regulated. Feasts, dances, and religious ceremonies were structured to maintain propriety, while allowing limited opportunity for observation and interaction. A simple dance, a brief conversation during a procession, or even a shared task at a feast could serve as an opportunity to signal interest without transgressing social boundaries. Young people learned to communicate through gestures, subtle glances, or carefully phrased remarks, all within the context of highly scrutinized public spaces. Courtship was a performance, with every participant navigating a web of observation, expectation, and social consequence. The slow pace of these rituals, while often frustrating, allowed relationships to develop gradually. Young people had the opportunity to observe consistency of behavior, assess reliability, and cultivate mutual understanding over time. Courtship was as much about learning to read each other's character as it was about expressing desire.